Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Dr. Alex Miller, the CTO of the United States Army, about the future of soldiers training alongside autonomous systems, how much new technology to put in a soldier's hands, and how the Army is building capabilities that can withstand even the most extreme conditions. And then we break down Iran's refusal to budge on its ballistic missile program, Russia's strategy of trading men for ground in Ukraine, and the mysterious case of an apparent anti-drone laser test in Texas that almost shut down the El Paso airport. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent here at the Washington Times. I'm joined this week by Washington Times national security and tech correspondent John Seward, who is becoming a familiar face or voice on the show, and we are certainly happy for that. And this week's podcast is brought to you by General Atomics Aeronautical Systems, maker of the short takeoff and landing Mojave, the unmanned aircraft that gives warfighters on the ground the ultimate edge. Learn more at UAV.com. Coming up in just a few minutes, John and I will have an exclusive interview with Dr. Alex Miller, the Chief Technology Officer for the Army. And we do a deep dive into how the Army is managing the rapid acceleration of technology in the 21st century and much, much more. But before we get there, John, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Yeah, thanks for having me on this week, Ben. Glad to hop on. You know, I was taking a look at our coverage over the last few days, and two things stuck out to me that I think both have a little bit of a Russia tie-in. The first is we had Guillaume Pitak, who is an awesome correspondent. He's our Ukraine correspondent who's actually over there right now. He did a fascinating piece that included a lot of video that he sent over to us, doing a little bit of a behind the scenes on how Ukraine is going about their new drone strategies to combat Russian forces. But one of the key takeaways that he had was sort of the way that this is changing warfare, right? He talked about how Russia is essentially exchanging men for ground, taking massive casualties just to take these small pieces of terrain, and that you just don't really see the large armored column or these big assault forces trying to take large chunks of terrain anymore in this portion of the conflict. Instead, you know, because those things are so susceptible to this new drone threat, you're seeing folks lean in on the battlefield on both sides to this exchange of essentially like speed for security. This is something that it gets talked a lot and talked about a lot in military circles, is that you have to balance speed and security, right? You can have this massive armored vehicle, but it's going to be slower. And Patak actually saw Russians moving in small squads on foot to have a much lower signature as they tried to move forward, or actually moving on motorcycles to just really amp up that speed and make themselves harder targets for those drone attacks by Ukraine. So I thought that was a fascinating piece. Another tie-in with Russia that I want to point out, our Asia editor, Andrew Salmon, actually did a great piece talking about how North Korean troops are back in Ukraine. Early last year, we saw the tail end of these shock troops fighting in the trenches alongside of the Russians from North Korea. But now it's sort of switched into that artillery fight in support of Russia. And for me, I think these are interesting stories to point out for our listeners, just because there's a little bit of a through line here, right? On the one hand, you have Patak, he's talking about drones. Drones are small, cheap, fast. They use a lot less expensive munitions to get the job done. And they're essentially replacing what North Korea is supporting Russia with, which is this artillery focus and this rocket focus, where the munitions are a little bit more expensive. You have to expend more of them for the same effect. And I think that dynamic between those two stories is something fascinating that we're seeing literally change the way that not just warfare happens in Russia and Ukraine, but the way that sort of the world is starting to think about force on force conflict.
It's interesting too, having talked to folks familiar with sort of the Russian military and how they think about this. It's amazing the lengths that they've gone to now over this 4-year conflict to avoid drawing personnel from Moscow and that area or St. Petersburg. So, sort of the middle class of Russia, they've gone to great lengths to send convicts to the front lines, to find North Koreans to go fight there, to essentially try to keep the pain away from the Russian populace at large to the extent that they're able to. And you wonder how long that can actually continue.
Yeah, and you point out something interesting, right? Which is they're avoiding these sort of major city centers and the troops that are associated with those regions. The structure of Russia's forces is a little bit more regional than we would think about it here in the United States. We're a little bit more sort of melting pot. Everybody moves around as part of their, being members of the armed forces. One of the byproducts that I've heard some experts from Europe tell me about using those outside edges, those are some of their very specific terrain expertise. One of those units is a Russian mechanized infantry unit that was known as being Russia's Arctic experts. That unit has been decimated, and they're losing a lot of that expertise on the Russian side.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I want to talk for a couple minutes here, John, about this situation in El Paso that hit just like a whirlwind yesterday on Wednesday. We got this surprise announcement from the FAA that it was closing the airspace around the El Paso airport for 10 days for security reasons, a decision that was reversed just a couple of hours later in very public and chaotic fashion. The White House then said the situation stemmed from Mexican drug cartel drones that had actually crossed into the U.S. and had to be taken out. But there's a lot of conflicting information about all of this, including sources who have told Threat Status there's a behind-the-scenes dispute between the FAA and the Pentagon about these apparent laser weapons that the Pentagon is testing, counter-drone laser weapons meant to shoot down, among other things, drug smuggling drones sent by Mexican cartels. So a ton to unpack here, including, of course, John, this New York Times report that one of the laser weapons actually took down a party balloon, not a drone. I don't know if that's actually true. It's certainly embarrassing if it is, and I can see why the White House might want to sweep that one under the rug. But in a second, I want to ask you about the tech involved, because you've written extensively about drones and counter-drone technology. But I want to first touch on the lack of communication to me, which is kind of staggering. I mean, for starters, El Paso officials said they have no idea this was coming. Shutting down a major airport for 10 days with no warning is a huge deal for a local economy and for local security and law enforcement and aviation officials. And the city said they did not know this was coming at all. So there's that. There doesn't seem to have been a lot of communication, if any, between the Pentagon and Border Patrol and the FAA. And let me just say this as someone who's now covered 4 administrations. This is the kind of thing, from my perspective, that the White House National Security Council would usually be across. The NSC, in theory, would have made sure all these different bodies were communicating with each other, especially when it involves a policy or a issue like immigration enforcement that's so front and center to everything this administration is wanting to do. But the NSC in the Trump administration has been downsized, to put it mildly. Critics say it's essentially been gutted. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is the acting national security advisor, which means in theory, he oversees the NSC staff and manages some interagency comms coming out of the White House with the FAA, with the Pentagon, with the Border Control. But needless to say, he's pretty busy in his other job as the country's top diplomat. So there's that aspect of the story that I'm certainly going to be following in the days and weeks to come. But on the tech side, John, what are we hearing about what this thing actually was? This counter-drone laser, was this directed energy or an EW capability? What are you hearing about the thing itself here?
What I find interesting about this, I haven't talked to a lot of the folks there in El Paso about the situation. But there is one testing that I was aware of just an hour north. So obviously El Paso, the very far western portion of the state of Texas, just north of that, you have the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. Well, guess what's being tested out at the White Sands Missile Range? You actually have multiple kilowatt, a specific one was like a 10 kilowatt laser weapon meant to bring down small drones, and that was being tested at White Sands not too long ago. This discussion of sort of who actually owns this device, I think is also important. To your point, there's a little bit of a lack of clarity, not just on the coordination, on the heads up. That seems very obvious, right? The FAA was not aware of this. And, we talked a second ago about how for them, they have to be aware of that threat and then figure it out before they can resume operations. But on the DoD side, it seems like there's this sort of back and forth over, was it Border Patrol or was it the Department of Defense? And like I said, the Department of Defense is the one that's actually testing those weapons to the largest extent, to my knowledge.
Hard to overstate for the FAA how big of a deal this is. I mean, especially with the fire they've been under recently for, the crash at Reagan Airport or any number of other, high profile incidents that we've seen, tons of flight cancellations recently. There's just been a lot. The FAA has been a little bit in battle. And so you can understand certainly why the head of the FAA and the transportation secretary aren't going to take any chances if there's even a 0.00001% chance of a laser weapon taking down a civilian airliner over Texas. So I can understand where they're coming from on that. Quickly, before we get to Dr. Alex Miller, I wrote this week in the Washington Times about Iran's ballistic missile program and why it seems like it's downright refusing to even put it on the table in ongoing talks with the Trump administration. The U.S., of course, wants to put limits on both Iran's nuclear enrichment and its ballistic missile program, which is the largest and most advanced in the Middle East. Iran's estimated to have about 2,000 ballistic missiles, many of which can hit Israel and certainly can hit U.S. bases in the region. The federal government estimates Iran could have as many as 60 ICBMs or intercontinental ballistic missiles, the longest range, in about a decade. So why are they so reluctant to give it up? There's two main reasons I found in the course of my reporting. One is they really do believe it's the best form of self-preservation that they have. It became clear last year that Israel and the U.S. essentially can kind of hit Iran at will, while Iran's attacks against Israel, including ballistic missile attacks, were mostly thwarted. So you might think that reality could diminish the importance of ballistic missiles in the eyes of Iranian leadership. But I think counterintuitively, I'm told from sources that the opposite has actually happened. They believe that they need to hold on to them at all costs because if all hell breaks loose, at least they have something they can fire back at Israeli and American assets in the region as opposed to signing away potentially their nuclear and ballistic missile assets, which in their view might leave them even more exposed than they clearly already are. But the second, and to me, more fascinating reason is the historical and what one source called mystical importance of these weapons to the Iranians. Ballistic missiles were a big part of the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, widely credited with helping Iran at least fight the Iraqi side to what was essentially a stalemate. So perception has sort of become reality here, and you've had a couple generations of Iranian military leaders grown up believing that these ballistic missiles are absolutely crucial to the country's self-defense, but also are just part of its military identity, if you will, certainly of its history. And I want to give a little credit before we move on, John, quickly to U.S. intelligence agencies here, because in the course of my reporting for this story, I just came across a declassified 1986 CIA paper that pretty accurately, almost to the letter, predicted exactly what Iran would do with respect to its ballistic missile and nuclear programs over the next 4 decades. Of course, the intel community, of course, famously got a few things wrong when it came to Iraq and its weapons programs. But in this case, it was almost chilling to read predictions from 1986 that Iran would more or less do exactly what it's done with ballistic missiles and nuclear enrichment over the past 40 years. And we are joined now by Dr. Alex Miller, the Army's Chief Technology Officer. Thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Good to see you again, sir. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. I'm going to attribute the great and glorious 20-degree climate and temperature today in DC to this session.
It felt downright balmy this morning when I walked outside compared to what we've been used to for the past 2 weeks. So I appreciate your efforts on that front. Listen, I want to start with this. We've got a lot to get to in a short amount of time here. But look, you've, I think, touched on just about every type of military technology possible, it seems like, over the course of your career, starting out working for Army intelligence and now being sort of a right-hand man to General George. In this race we found ourselves, next generation technology, staying ahead of our adversaries. So, what I'm always curious about, when I talk to folks like yourself who are knee deep in this, every day of your life, What's the pace of technological advancement like from your vantage point, even over just the past 2 years, watching it from the perch of a journalist? It's unlike anything that I've really ever seen. So for somebody who's tasked with sort of modernizing that inside the Army, what's it been like to just watch this pace of development that we're in the midst of right now?
No, those are astute observations. It's been really interesting, and rather than just saying platitudes, because it's very easy to say the pace of technical innovation is always increasing. That's a realism in the tech sense. I like to tell stories because that's real. That's how we communicate, but it's also how we show that there's actual progress going on. 5 years ago, 2021. Coming out of COVID, when I was in the G2 and I was in the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, we wanted to modernize the intelligence architecture. So all of the software and hardware that sort of enabled our analysts to do analysis, produce intelligence reports, really hunt the bad guys during the global war on terror. And that process had taken, in the last generation of technology, about 7 years. And in the current generation, it took us about 2 years. And now, as we think about things like next generation command and control, so the suite of software and hardware, everything from the radios that a soldier carries up through what a commander would have in their vehicle to make decisions. We are doing that in monthly sprints for totally revamping those architectures, adding new software, pulling software out, adding new radios, changing the way that those radios work. So our spin cycle has gone from, the better part of a decade to a couple of years to a couple of months, and now we're sort of on weekly spin cycles, the way you would expect in a not even a high tech company, just a company that wants to stay current.
Okay. One quick follow-up before I bring John Seward in here to get into dig a little deeper on some of this stuff. I'm curious from sort of a broad perspective, how you look at what soldiers are going to be asked to do technologically in the 21st century. I mean, we can drill. There's all kinds of examples, of course, whether it's eventually being able to sort of 3D print parts for their own drone and fix them when they're out, on the front lines somewhere. How do you sort of balance the fact that we have all these cool new things that especially young soldiers probably want to do and are able to do versus not giving them so much on their plate that they're overwhelmed?
Sure. It's a good question. You're seeing AI burnout because what's happening is organizations are using AI and they're expecting their humans to do the same things, but more of it. So we want to avoid that. What we would like to do is we would like to use the technology and go through and fundamentally better architect what soldiers are required to do and what formations are required to do. So for example, we don't want to make processes that are bad go faster. That just turns into bad processes going faster. What we do want to do is better understand what do we expect our formations to do if we know that we're going into combat and we need to breach, so we need to clear mines, move through obstacles, make sure that our soldiers can get to where they need to be. Instead of just saying, hey, we're going to throw more soldiers at that, we're going to give them drones to do it. What we are doing is taking a step back and going, what's the best way to do that now with the technology that's available? Maybe it's robots. Maybe it's robots actually going up there. So the first thing that the enemy sees is not American soldiers, it's American technology. And we are not trading, we're not putting soldiers as the first line. We're trading blood for steel, and it's steel on our side and blood on their side. So it's rethinking how we expect our soldiers to fight. The second thing is not just throwing technology at the problem, because that's not how you solve problems. It's fundamentally understanding how to enable soldiers to do the thing we need them to do better.
You sort of touched on it a little bit, sir. This idea of sending forward steel to sort of soak up a lot of enemy fire effectively. We're starting to see, and it looks like the new unmanned version of the Black Hawk is moving forward. I saw some testing with some unmanned breaching vehicles, which I think you just mentioned, right? Talking about like moving through the breach with technology. I want to ask though, like, what does the roadmap look like to go from where we are right now, where we're seeing those technologies very much in development and doing that, as you put it, weekly spin cycle, to actually starting to have, a place where soldiers are training alongside some of these systems?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to tell you a story. So it's sort of like if you want to bake an apple pie from scratch, first you got to create the universe. So let me tell you where we step back a little bit, and then I'll explain how we're going to achieve what you're asking. So previously, what we would do is we had 100 flowers blooming where units got to build or buy robots. And then we had things like Project Convergence going on, where we were showing sort of the cutting edge of what's going on. And then we had some R&D efforts, and we had some lab efforts, and we had some industry efforts, generally very diffuse and not very effective at achieving a core result. So two things happen in parallel. The first one is with the acquisition reform that the Sec War put out. The way that the Army implemented that in our portfolios was to actually stand up a capability portfolio executive for mission autonomy. And in doing so, what we were able to do is pull together many of the efforts that had been disparate and make sure that they were under one organization. In doing so, we also selected a few use cases. So breaching is one, autonomous resupply is one, things like CASEVAC or medevac will be another one. And then rather than having that acquisition force think about things like you're going to buy a robot, you're going to buy a sensor, you're going to buy a radio, we're organizing the acquisition around the capability itself and asking industry to come together as a team to say, how should you or how could you solve this problem, rather than saying, I need a robot to do breaching. Well, any robot can do breaching if you run over a mine. That's not the intent that we're trying to go over or trying to achieve. The second part of that is actually allowing units to describe how they want to achieve that effect and letting industry sit with them and understand it. So we had I won't name it because I'm excited, but they want to do some of their own press in the near future. We had a company that's very well known, but not necessarily in the defense space, out with us in California, thinking through how do you build robots on normal factory lines rather than specialized lines, so they're lower cost. We had other companies come out in Europe and sit with our UC team and understand what does it really mean to be integrated in a maneuver formation. And for those playing along at home, if you're not ingratiated in Army lingo, having soldiers that have to walk and carry rucksacks and carry rifles, what does it mean to actually support them in a meaningful way? Not some of the gamey ways that we've seen where it's just a robot with 8 wheels that's driving along. How do you actually imbue some decision making and go, I need you to go up here. I need you to assess if there's a risk. If there's a risk, I need you to do something about it. And then I need you to make sure that you are keeping us in the loop the whole time.
Part of what you're talking about, right, is this human autonomous teaming, rather than, like you put it, not just sort of the show pony of, hey, I can walk alongside you and you can tell me go forward an extra 50 meters. One of the examples, just because you specifically mentioned it, right, is the breaching. I saw a video of some testing. This was just a few weeks ago, of a essentially an autonomous vehicle shooting the MICLIC, which is like the very long shape charge that we use to blow our way through large obstacles. When you're talking about that teaming and you're talking about using drones to soak up enemy attack, are those the examples that you guys are interested in and investing in?
A couple. So I like the MICLIC. So if you've never seen a MICLIC, it is a 2,000-pound explosive line charge that the way that it works is it drives up to the edge of a minefield and it shoots that line charge like a grappling hook. And the whole point is that it lays flat and it detonates, and you've cleared a way through the minefield with explosives. So you blow up things so you don't blow up. But that is its only purpose. Like, there is not another purpose. It is very, very bespoke in its use case. That's a great use case, but it doesn't translate to how do I have a more general purpose robot that might be something I put counter UAS on. So if you've heard any of the Army leadership, they talk about how we attain modularity, how we maintain open systems. So yes, the MICLIC is one use case on how do we get a lower cost, purpose-built, attritable robotic system. The other side is how do we work with industry so that we have really inexpensive chassis, think pickup truck chassis, that if one unit needs an autonomous vehicle that can literally walk with them, move with their formation that's got 30 millimeter cannons on it or electronic warfare equipment to knock drones out of the sky, it could be that. The next day, it could be an autonomous resupply truck that can carry 1,500 pounds back and forth. The next day, it could be, it could be an offensive tool set.
I think you and I both are about to head up north here pretty soon. There's a lot that goes into these new technologies to harden them against extreme environments. And I know that one of the things that I'm very interested to see in these coming weeks is sort of how we're solving some of those problems in the extreme cold. But from sort of your perspective, the big umbrella, how are you seeing us push the envelope around extreme environments and actually having these things be useful, not just in sort of the perfect lab conditions in California?
Sure. No, it's a great question. One is recognizing that not everything needs to be hardened all the time. So in the past, what we would do is the Army would put out a requirements document, and it would be several hundred pages, but it would try to cover every possible edge case that could be out there. It would cover extreme heat, extreme cold, extreme temperature fluctuation. Some of our requirements documents also had nuclear hardening for things that you probably don't need to survive a nuclear blast. But the intent was you could have, if you got the requirement approved, every possible situation that we could go into could be covered with that piece of equipment. Now, what that led to was, and there's been plenty of reports over time of the $500 hammer or the $1,000 screw. Those are all down traces of when you over specify your requirement, everything becomes much more expensive. What we have been taking is a slightly different approach. And that approach is, if we characterize the general need, if we stop being a bad customer and we say, here's the direction I really need to go for 80% of my use cases, then we can figure out what that sort of common thing is. And then if we can figure out, hey, for 20% of my use cases, I'm going to be in absolutely abysmal conditions. How about we tailor just a small amount to that instead of trying to make everything meet it? And I'll give you two examples. So at last year, I was at 3rd Brigade, 10th Mountains Joint Multinational Readiness Center, JMRC training event in Hohenfels, Germany. So February in Hohenfels, Germany. The first 3 days of their rotation, it rained. It was about 29 degrees. The last 7 days of their rotation, it didn't rain, but it was about 23 degrees. And what we saw was the drones that we had, and they had several hundred for that unit. We got about 20 to 30% of the battery life expectation. We got about 40 to 50% of the range, just because of all the moisture that was in the flora and the fauna that was out there. We were crushed on the ability to actually use some of our technologies just because of the extreme conditions. That allowed us to focus in on those unique conditions and set up several R&D projects where industry wasn't really interested in solving those problems, because it's not, the total addressable market for that is very small. So what you will see as we get up to JPMRC in Alaska, where we were updated yesterday, it got up to a high of -1, and it will drop back down to the -30s, is the Army took on building some heating elements for batteries, so that now those commercial components, which we want to go commercial as much as we can, now we can augment them so that they work in those really extreme conditions.
Dr. Miller, in the couple minutes we have left, one more question. And in some ways, we probably could have started with this because it's a little bit broad and philosophical. And it comes from the perspective of somebody who goes to a lot of defense conferences and shows and whatnot. And this is always at the top of my mind, because you go to these shows and see a lot of cool new systems and companies trying to sell a lot of cool new things. But for somebody in your position, there's obviously a lot of systems the Army uses, a lot of technologies that need to be replaced, but some just need to be updated and modernized. And like, that might not be quite as exciting or sexy as something new that a company's trying to sell you. So how do you sort of balance that? Where do we actually need to replace this thing with something entirely new, or does it just need to be updated?
No, it's a good question. It sort of invokes the ship of Theseus paradox, where if you replace the parts for something over time, and you get to the point where you've replaced every part, is it still the same ship? Is it still the same system? And what I would offer is, yes, if you do it smartly. So what we've done with, and I'll take our business systems or our readiness systems as an example. So prior to last year, the Army had over 800 of these things that we call defense business systems or readiness systems. Things like the pay system, things like how we track our munitions, things like how we track our people. So we had over 800. And the one that we always pick on is we had a birthday system. So it was a system that was supposed to track birthdays in the Army, and there was a person that managed that, and there was an entire server stack that ran it, and there was a way to interface with it. But we also have like really, really important systems, like the thing that pays all of our soldiers, that it has to work all the time. So what we made a deliberate choice on was some of those business systems that are really important, you can't bring them down. they've been operating for 20 or 30 years. It's probably time that rather than just ripping them all out and trying to replace all of them, maybe we pull out some of the back end functions and we replace those with a modern foundation. And after we do that, we can start working on the way that they engage other systems. We can replace those slowly with modern interfaces, and then somewhere down the line, we can replace the way that users interact with them with something much more modern. So at the end of that, we won't have ripped it all out and tried to start from scratch. We won't have tried to break everything and pull something new. And what we will have done is what happens commercially very often, which is by replacing those hard, fast, very tightly coupled components with modular components, we will have enabled ourselves to continue to update those in perpetuity in the future. That is the same way that your Instagram, your Facebook, the apps on your phone all work, because at some point they were all very, very tightly coupled stacks. And then all of those companies said, hey, maybe I don't want to have to replace this app every single time. I want to update the messaging features. I want to update the news feed features. I want to update how the images are posted features. You're right. We don't have to rip and replace something new every single time. But for some of these, we do need to take the time and set a really strong foundation so that we can update them as necessary into the future.
Dr. Alex Miller, the Army's Chief Technology Officer, thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me, guys.
This week's podcast is brought to you by General Atomics Aeronautical Systems, maker of the short takeoff and landing Mojave, the unmanned aircraft that gives warfighters on the ground the ultimate edge. Learn more at uav.com. And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where we each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you listen to the show. My threat of the week is Chinese and Russian space weapons and the threats they pose to the U.S. Friend of the show, Bill Gertz, had a fantastic exclusive story in the Washington Times this week, in which he interviewed General B. Chance Saltzman, the chief of space operations at the U.S. Space Force, about the Space Force's commitment to space dominance and the race to build space-based missiles and other capabilities in order to keep pace with Russia and China and stay ahead of Russia and China. This is, of course, a top priority for the Pentagon. They deserve credit for it, I think, as do some lawmakers on Capitol Hill who have really zeroed in on this issue when it comes to writing budgets and directing money. But it's worth taking a minute to consider the capabilities of our adversaries, because according to the U.S. intelligence community and their latest annual threat assessment, China poses the central space threat and has fielded all kinds of space capabilities, including electronic warfare systems, directed energy weapons, anti-satellite missiles, and a whole lot of other sort of potentially disastrous and catastrophic systems that could harm the U.S. and its satellites. We talked before in the show at length about Russia's pursuit of anti-satellite or ASAT weapons, up to and including a nuclear-armed ASAT weapon that could use an actual nuclear blast to take out American satellites. So go read Bill Gertz's story on this. Watch Guy Taylor's exclusive interview with General Saltzman from just a couple weeks ago. You can listen to Robert Lightfoot, the head of Lockheed Martin Space, on this show, or John Benevenia, the Chief Master Sergeant of the Space Force, also in this podcast recently, all of whom talked about this very subject. But for today, it's my threat of the week because we almost can't talk enough about how rapidly America's top adversaries are trying to expand their space warfare capabilities.
Yeah, and Ben, you bring up our colleague Bill Gertz, and he and I have been reporting on something that I think is similar and touches on my threat of the week, and that's the New START treaty. As Bill and I have covered New START and sort of the way that it has expired, the thing that hasn't come up is what happens now. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion around it in sort of the geopolitical and non-proliferation expert circles. Right now, there are reports that both countries have agreed to keep talking and to try to build some sort of follow-on agreement. But in the interim, the treaty has expired, which means each country can now actually deploy more of those strategic nuclear weapons out into their force And there's really no kind of precedent or agreement or understanding that they're bumping up against if they were to do that. One of the things that I find the most interesting about this that's already been reported out, but I think is worth paying attention to. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said publicly to the Russian lawmakers that, quote, the moratorium declared by the president will remain as long as the U.S. doesn't exceed these limits. And to me, Lavrov saying that publicly is just a fascinating piece of the puzzle of us trying to understand what these negotiations look like, what a future treaty might look like, because effectively the treaty is still being abided by both countries, but there's no legal binding agreement to have them actually do that. It's just sort of these public statements back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good one. And I think one of the biggest stories I'll be watching in 2026 is what, if anything, the Trump administration actually does to try to get this sort of elusive U.S., Russia, China nuclear arms control deal that it says it wants. We'll see if that actually comes to fruition at all. So thank you for that. And of course, a huge thanks to Dr. Alex Miller, the Army CTO, for that fantastic interview. And a big thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and we'll be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.